June 16, 1943, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The tropical sun had not yet fully surmounted the rugged peaks of the Owen Stanley Range when Captain Jay Zeamer Jr. ignited the formidable quartet of Wright Cyclone engines powering his B-17E bomber. This particular aircraft, officially designated 41-266, but universally recognized by its evocative moniker, Old 666, rested at the extreme end of the runway, its fuel tanks brimmed to capacity for a 10-hour aerial journey, and its ammunition stores sufficient to precipitate a minor conflict. Conspicuously absent, however, was any form of protective escort. Zeamer was poised to embark upon an audacious flight, traversing over 1,000 miles deep into the most stringently defended Japanese airspace within the Pacific theater, entirely unchaperoned. Aboard with him was a hand-picked complement of 9 intrepid volunteers, each acutely aware that their prospects of returning were perilously slender, bordering on non-existent. The mission briefing had been delivered with unvarnished candor. Allied intelligence urgently required detailed reconnaissance photographs of Buka and Bougainville, strategically vital islands situated in the northern Solomon Islands. Japanese forces were engaged in a significant expansion of their airfield infrastructure there, and General MacArthur's strategists desperately needed precise intelligence regarding the adversary's capabilities before initiating the ambitious Operation Cardwheel. The fundamental predicament was that Buka lay approximately 600 miles within hostile territory, encompassed by a formidable array of at least 400 Japanese fighter aircraft dispersed across numerous airfields. Standard military doctrine unequivocally mandated that photoreconnaissance missions be accompanied by fighter escorts. However, the immense distances involved rendered this impossible. No Allied fighter aircraft in the Pacific possessed the requisite operational range to complete the round trip. Consequently, one aircraft would be compelled to proceed alone, maintaining a deliberate and stable flight path crucial for optimal photographic acquisition, and fervently hoping that its crew could forcefully repel any Japanese aerial incursions. Prior to Zeamer's acceptance, 3 distinct crews had already unequivocally declined this perilous assignment. Official military records employed more circumspect phrasing, noting that the missions were declined due to tactical concerns, yet the stark, unvarnished reality was considerably simpler. Seasoned pilots, upon scrutinizing the navigational charts and meticulously calculating the numerical probabilities, had unequivocally informed their commanding officers that this was not a mission, it was a premeditated suicide run with additional, elaborate steps. You would be piloting a heavy bomber in solitary isolation over formidable enemy strongholds at predictable altitudes and consistent speeds, a necessity dictated by the exacting requirements of 1943-era photographic equipment for stable platforms. The Japanese would inevitably detect your approach from a distance of 50 miles or more, affording them ample time to scramble every Zero fighter within operational range. In such a scenario, you would possess no sanctuary and no external assistance. It was at this critical juncture that someone proposed the name of Jay Zeamer. This recommendation was not predicated on his being the preeminent pilot within the squadron, though by this particular point in the war, he had arguably attained such a status. Rather, Zeamer possessed an established reputation for accepting missions that all others eschewed, and with an uncanny regularity, somehow managing to return. He had piloted Old 666 on numerous mapping expeditions over previously uncharted and treacherous sections of New Guinea, consistently managing to evade Japanese patrols by a narrow margin. His crew reposed in him a degree of loyalty that verged on profound religious conviction. Furthermore, his bomber was far from an ordinary B-17. Through countless months of diligent scavenging, ingenious modification, and what the maintenance crews affectionately termed creative engineering. Zeamer had meticulously transformed Old 666 into the most formidable and heavily armed bomber operating within the entire Pacific theater. When headquarters presented him with the Buka mission, Zeamer exhibited no hesitation whatsoever. He diligently scrutinized the navigational charts, meticulously calculated fuel consumption rates, engaged in thorough discussions with his dedicated crew, and ultimately assented. His decision was not born of a morbid death wish, nor did it stem from a failure to comprehend the inherent peril. Instead, it was driven by the grim reality that 9 Allied air crews were currently marooned in the treacherous waters surrounding Bougainville, having been shot down during preceding operations, now desperately concealing themselves from relentless Japanese patrols and awaiting a rescue that seemed increasingly remote. The crucial reconnaissance photographs from this mission would furnish rescue coordinators with precise intelligence regarding enemy positions, delineate safe transit routes, and identify suitable islands for potential pickup points. These invaluable photographs held the power to represent the definitive distinction between life and death for nearly 100 imperiled men. Thus, on that fateful June morning, Zeamer and his crew ascended into the cockpit of Old 666, meticulously executed their pre-flight checks, and commenced their roll down the runway at Port Moresby. The control tower conveyed its wishes for good hunting. No one uttered the customary "see you later" as the bomber achieved liftoff and veered northward, gradually vanishing into the hazy coastal expanse. More than a few members of the ground crew harbored a chilling apprehension that they had just witnessed 10 men embark upon their final, fatal journey. To fully grasp the intricate reasons behind Jay Zeamer's eventual undertaking of the mission that every other crew had steadfastly refused, one must first comprehend the circumstances under which he initially acquired Old 666. For this narrative transcends the conventional military tale of elite personnel being furnished with the most advanced equipment. Instead, it chronicles the remarkable odyssey of a pilot whom no one initially desired, inheriting a bomber that no one wanted, and through an indomitable will and an unwavering refusal to accept limitations, transforming both into enduring legends. Zeamer had earned an engineering degree from MIT prior to the outbreak of the war, subsequently receiving his pilot wings in 1941. His arrival in the Pacific Theater in 1942 was marked by exceptional flying acumen, but tragically ill timing. His original crew was disbanded before they ever had the opportunity to execute a single combat mission together. Command subsequently reassigned him as a backup pilot, essentially relegating him to the role of a spare, a provisional replacement, who would fill in when regular pilots were indisposed or on leave. For a man whose deepest aspiration was to fly combat missions, this demotion was profoundly humiliating. Months elapsed. He found himself engaged in mundane cargo runs, routine mail deliveries, and the occasional transport mission, never the truly consequential work, never direct combat. The fundamental issue, as perceived by his superiors, was Zeamer's propensity for expressing strong opinions. He frequently questioned tactical approaches he deemed inefficient. He proactively suggested aircraft modifications that the maintenance mechanics had not solicited. He dedicated his off-duty hours to an intensive study of Japanese fighter tactics rather than engaging in card games with his fellow pilots. Within the rigid hierarchical structure of military aviation, such behavior invariably labeled him a troublemaker. A personnel report from early 1943 notably indicated that while Lieutenant Zeamer was technically proficient, he showed insufficient deference to established protocols. This was, in essence, officer speak for. This individual believes himself to be intellectually superior to his commanding officers, and no one desires to contend with such an attitude. Then came Old 666. The bomber had sustained severe damage during a mission in early 1943. Its original crew had barely managed to guide it back to Port Moresby. A comprehensive damage assessment revealed numerous perforations in the fuselage, a partially obliterated tail section, and engine maladies that would necessitate weeks of intensive repair work. The aircraft was technically salvageable, but only just. It was subsequently towed to the remote far end of the airfield, a designated area where damaged aircraft languished, awaiting parts, attention, or their ultimate fate, scrapping. For the vast majority of pilots, Old 666 would have remained entirely unnoticed, merely another broken bird amidst dozens. Zeamer, however, perceived an unparalleled opportunity. He approached his commanding officer with a bold proposition. "Permit me to repair it, and allow me to retain it. I will assemble my own crew, execute our own missions, and remain entirely out of everyone's way." The response was essentially an indifferent, "Certainly, do as you please," the kind of perfunctory permission granted when one harbors no expectation of tangible results. Thus, Zeamer immediately commenced his arduous undertaking. He recruited a bombardier named Joe Sarnowski, an equally unconventional individual who had also found himself confined to non-combat roles despite his evident skills. Subsequently, he assembled waist gunners, a dedicated radio operator, a meticulous navigator, all men who had been overlooked, underestimated, or were simply weary of patiently awaiting their definitive opportunity to demonstrate their true capabilities. Together, they meticulously rebuilt Old 666 from its innermost components outwards. However, Zeamer did not merely restore it to its original factory specifications. He ingeniously transformed it into something the original Boeing engineers had never even contemplated. A standard B-17E typically carried 13.50 caliber machine guns. Zeamer, through diligent effort, augmented this armament with an additional 6, meticulously scavenging weapons from other damaged aircraft and installing them in bespoke, custom-designed positions. He further reinforced the nose section with robust armor plating, a modification technically in contravention of regulations, but one that went unchecked. He ingeniously modified the bomb bay to accommodate extra ammunition stores rather than its maximum bomb load, shrewdly reasoning that in the demanding realm of photo reconnaissance, they would require bullets far more than bombs. He even engineered the installation of supplementary guns capable of firing directly downwards through the fuselage, thereby effectively protecting the highly vulnerable belly area, the preferred point of attack for most Japanese fighters. The maintenance crews regarded his relentless dedication as an obsession. Other pilots frequently made light-hearted jests about Zeamer's flying porcupine. Yet, when Old 666 finally rolled back onto the active flight line in May 1943, it was a truly unparalleled bomber within the Pacific theater. It possessed a greater operational weight than standard B-17s owing to the extensive additional weaponry and armor. Consequently, it was technically slower for the identical reason. However, in a combat engagement, it possessed the capacity to unleash more defensive firepower than bombers twice its physical size. Zeamer had masterfully transmuted his engineering acumen and his months of profound frustration into a decisive tactical advantage. By June 1943, Zeamer and his crew had successfully completed a sufficient number of mapping missions to unequivocally demonstrate their competence, not necessarily as outstanding individuals or celebrated heroes, but rather as an eccentric collective of disciplined misfits who consistently performed solid work and meticulously avoided any undue trouble. This precise reputation was precisely why, When headquarters found itself in dire need of someone for a mission fraught with terrible odds and devoid of any potential glory, their thoughts invariably turned to the unconventional troublemaker pilot and his uniquely modified Frankenstein bomber. After all, should circumstances take an adverse turn, they would not be sacrificing their most esteemed personnel. The arduous flight to Buka consumed nearly 4 hours, and for the preponderance of that duration, an almost serene tranquility prevailed. Old 666 droned steadily northward over the vast expanse of the Solomon Sea at an altitude of 25,000 feet, sufficiently high to evade the majority of anti-aircraft fire, yet low enough to obviate the crew's constant reliance on supplemental oxygen. Zeamer meticulously kept the engines throttled back, judiciously conserving precious fuel. Every single gallon would be indispensable for the demanding return journey. Navigator Ruby Johnston diligently consulted his charts, issuing precise course corrections. Radio operator Forrest Dillman assiduously monitored various frequencies, vigilantly listening for any indication that Japanese radar had detected their presence. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Joe Sarnosky made final, meticulous adjustments to the cameras, scrupulously verifying angles and exposure settings. A palpable tension permeated the aircraft, yet it was the manageable tension characteristic of seasoned professionals engaged in exceptionally difficult and high-stakes work. At approximately 0900 hours, the crew of Old 666 arrived over Buka, commencing their crucial photography mission. Captain Zeamer meticulously guided the aircraft to an altitude of 20,000 feet, where he stabilized it for the vital camera pass. This segment of their operation presented the most profound vulnerability. To ensure the collected intelligence would be of strategic value, the B-17 was compelled to maintain a perfectly straight and level trajectory, adhering to precise altitude and airspeed parameters. Any deviation or evasive action was strictly forbidden, as the onboard cameras diligently recorded successive images of critical Japanese installations below, including airfields, fortified gun emplacements, and vital supply depots. This perilous photographic sweep was projected to last approximately 6 minutes, a protracted period during which their bomber would remain an unyieldingly exposed, slow-moving target deep within hostile skies. Barely 3 minutes into their critical photographic sweep, the tense quiet was abruptly shattered when Waist Gunner William Vaughan's keen eyes detected them. From the vicinity of Kahili Airfield, ominous black specks were rapidly ascending, swiftly closing the distance. After a meticulous double-check to confirm his count, Vaughn urgently activated his intercom. "Fighters, 5 o'clock high. Looks like zeros, skipper. I count at least 15, maybe 20, he reported, his voice laced with urgency. Captain Zeamer's reply, remarkably composed, almost casual, cut through the tension. "How long until they reach us, Ruby?" Navigator Ruby Johnston, performing rapid mental calculations, responded promptly. 3 minutes, perhaps 4. Zeamer offered a silent nod, unseen by his crew. "Joe, how much longer on the photo run?" he inquired of Bombardier Sarnosky. After a quick assessment of his equipment, Sarnosky confirmed. 3 more minutes for complete coverage. At this pivotal juncture, Zeamer confronted the excruciating choice that haunts every military leader: to abort the mission, retreat to safety with the objective unfulfilled, or to resolutely maintain their trajectory, complete the assignment, and confront the inevitable onslaught. Retreat was a prospect Zeamer dismissed without serious consideration. His command rang out with unwavering resolve. "All guns, get ready. We're finishing this run." Throughout the rear compartments of the aircraft, the gunners swiftly loaded their weapons, their gazes meticulously sweeping the vast expanse of sky. The distant specks rapidly coalesced, assuming the unmistakable profiles of Mitsubishi A6M0s, the legendary fighter aircraft that had reigned supreme over the Pacific theater for the initial 2 years of the conflict. These formidable machines were renowned for their exceptional speed and agility, piloted by individuals who had undergone extensive and rigorous training long before the outbreak of hostilities. According to intelligence briefings, the Japanese maintained a formidable contingent of approximately 400 fighters stationed across the northern Solomons. It appeared a substantial portion of this force was now being deployed to intercept Old 666. At precisely 0907 hours, the inaugural Zero executed its attack run, descending from a superior position directly astern, the archetypal maneuver for engaging bomber aircraft. The enemy pilot initiated his barrage from an approximate distance of 400 yards, sufficiently close for the crew to discern the fiery arcs of tracer rounds hurtling towards the B-17's tail section. Tail gunner Herbert Pugh responded without hesitation, his synchronized twin .50 caliber machine guns unleashing a torrent of rounds at an astonishing rate of 800 per minute. The attacking Zero abruptly disengaged, though whether its retreat was prompted by battle damage or prudent caution remained impossible to ascertain. Nevertheless, it was immediately succeeded by 3 additional enemy fighters, launching coordinated assaults from divergent angles. The ensuing aerial melee, though chronologically spanning a mere 13 minutes, stretched into what felt like an eternity compressed into fleeting seconds for the embattled crew of Old 666. The Japanese aviators were undeniably formidable opponents, representing some of the most accomplished pilots within their respective air groups. They had meticulously devised sophisticated tactics tailored specifically for engaging B-17s, orchestrating their assaults to strike simultaneously from multiple vectors, a strategy designed to utterly overwhelm the standard bomber's defensive firepower. Indeed, against typical B-17s manned by conventional crews, these coordinated maneuvers often proved devastatingly effective. However, Old 666 was no ordinary aircraft, nor was her crew. Thanks to Captain Zeamer's ingenious modifications, every gun position boasted meticulously engineered, interlocking fields of fire. Consequently, Zero's attempting rear attacks were met with a devastating crossfire from the tail guns, both waist guns, and the formidable dorsal turret. Assaults launched from beneath the bomber encountered the additional ventral gun that Zeamer had personally integrated. Even frontal attacks, typically a bomber's weakest point, were confronted not only by Sarnowski's potent nose gun, but also by enhanced, reinforced forward defensive positions. The colossal bomber vibrated violently under the sustained, rotating fusillade of 19.50 caliber machine guns. Spent brass casings rapidly accumulated across the floor, while the internal temperature soared beyond 100 degrees Fahrenheit, solely from the intense heat generated by the continuous gunfire. Amidst the chaos, gunners tirelessly shouted target identifications, urgent warnings, and damage assessments, all as the aircraft lurched and shuddered from repeated enemy impacts. With extraordinary dexterity, Zeamer piloted the B-17 as if engaged in a deadly aerial ballet, executing subtle, precise adjustments. These maneuvers were calibrated never to compromise the integrity of the crucial photographic mission, yet they were sufficient to deflect enemy aim by mere fractions of a degree, a critical margin distinguishing a direct hit from a harmless miss. Throughout this intense engagement, the cameras continued their tireless operation, capturing vital intelligence. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Joe Sarnowski remained steadfast at his station, methodically fine-tuning settings, replacing sped film magazines, and meticulously ensuring that each captured image would possess the requisite sharpness and utility. This unwavering focus underscored the paramount importance of their objective. Indeed, it was the very reason for their perilous journey. Nevertheless, the Zeros maintained their relentless assault, pressing in successive waves, and it became increasingly apparent that old 660 SIX's resilience was being severely tested, her fortune beginning to wane under the sustained pressure. At 9:12, the precarious balance of the battle shifted dramatically when a devastating 20mm cannon shell violently pierced the cockpit windscreen, detonating with destructive force within the confined space. The resulting shrapnel ripped savagely through the intricate instrument panel, severing critical control cables, and obliterating fully half of the essential gauges upon which Captain Zeamer depended for piloting. A searing fragment of hot metal, roughly the diameter of a quarter, embedded itself painfully into Zeamer's right arm, while another jagged piece carved a deep gash across his leg. Despite the immediate gush of blood that rapidly saturated his flight suit, Zeamer maintained an unyielding grip with both hands on the bomber's controls. The aircraft, against all odds, continued its flight. The cameras, miraculously, persisted in their operation. In that moment, all personal injury and structural damage became utterly secondary to the completion of the mission. Within the vulnerable nose compartment, Joe Sarnosky had just completed the crucial task of replacing a film magazine when a Zero materialized directly ahead, hurtling straight towards them, its gun spewing fire. This terrifying head-on assault represented the most dreaded form of attack for bomber crews, offering gunners only a fleeting few seconds to react before the enemy fighter rocketed past. Sarnosky, with a surge of adrenaline, deftly swung his .50 caliber machine gun forward and unleashed a torrent of fire, meticulously walking his tracer rounds into the Zero's engine cowling. The Japanese fighter visibly shuddered, beginning to trail smoke, but not before its synchronized weapons savagely raked the B-17's forward section. Sarnosky was violently thrown backward, struck multiple times in the abdomen and chest. The wounds he sustained were undeniably catastrophic, instantly recognizable to any medical professional as fatal injuries. Sarnosky himself was acutely aware of his impending demise, feeling his vital strength steadily ebbing with each weakening heartbeat. Yet, his weapon remained functional, and in relentless procession of Zeros continued to line up for their attack runs. Consequently, he refused to succumb to his injuries, neither lying down nor crying out for assistance, nor performing any of the understandable actions a dying man might be forgiven for. Instead, he resolutely gripped the gun's handles, braced his failing body against the navigator's table, and continued his defiant barrage. When yet another Zero flashed across the nose, Sarnosky's perfectly aimed burst caught it squarely, sending the enemy aircraft spiraling uncontrollably into the vast expanse of the ocean below. This marked his third confirmed kill of the engagement. He would account for one more before his body finally yielded to its grievous injuries. Concurrently, in the aft sections of the aircraft, the waist gunners found themselves confronting an equally dire predicament. The astute Japanese pilots had quickly discerned that old 660 SIX's most formidable concentration of defensive firepower was directed towards its rear and flanks. In response, they cleverly adapted their strategy, initiating attacks from less protected angles, specifically from below and forward, where the bomber's formidable array of guns offered reduced coverage. Waist gunner William Vaughan, with incredible resolve, leaned precariously out into the roaring slipstream, battling fiercely against the relentless 200 miles per hour winds, striving to bring his machine gun to bear on a Zero executing an audacious underneath pass. A brutal burst of 7.7mm rounds ripped across his exposed position, and he immediately registered searing impacts, one in his shoulder, another that narrowly grazed his skull. The world around him dissolved into a disorienting haze of red and dizziness. Yet, with extraordinary fortitude, he remained steadfastly at his gun. Tail gunner Herbert Pugh, entrenched in the cramped confines of the aircraft's stern, had been engaged in an almost incessant barrage for 8 grueling minutes. The relentless discharge had heated his gun barrels to such an extreme that they now emitted an ominous cherry-red glow within the dimness of the tail compartment. A critical shortage of ammunition was rapidly developing. He had expended nearly 1,500 rounds, and the remaining ammunition belts were visibly dwindling. As the Zero executed a swift high-side pass, Pugh tracked its trajectory with flawless precision, expertly leading the target just enough to compensate for its velocity and angle of approach. His stream of devastating rounds climbed inexorably along the fighter's fuselage, culminating in a direct hit on the cockpit. The Zero immediately inverted and plummeted earthward, leaving a vivid plume of fire in its wake. This successful engagement marked his 4th confirmed kill of the harrowing encounter, yet Pugh had long since ceased tallying his victories, understanding with grim certainty that the enemy's numbers felt inexhaustible. In the co-pilot's seat, John Britton had sustained severe shrapnel wounds to both legs when a 20mm shell detonated against the armor plating position behind his seat, a crucial, extra layer of protection that Captain Zeamer had installed in defiance of official regulations. While this unauthorized metal barrier had successfully absorbed the brunt of the fragments, a sufficient quantity had penetrated to inflict serious and debilitating damage. Britton's flight suit was now thoroughly soaked with his own blood, and each slight movement sent agonizing new waves of pain coursing through his body. He glanced across the cockpit at Zeamer, observing the captain slumped forward, visibly struggling to maintain consciousness. In that harrowing instant, Britton comprehended that their already desperate plight had just escalated exponentially. Should Zeamer completely lose consciousness, Britton would be thrust into the unenviable position of having to pilot old 666 back to base, despite suffering injuries that, under any normal circumstances, would have immediately mandated his hospitalization. High in the dorsal turret, gunner Johnny Zeal had been struck in the hand, a 20mm fragment tearing away 2 of his fingers. With remarkable self-possession, he swiftly improvised, wrapping the grievous wound with a strip torn from his own shirt, then continued to operate his weapon one-handed, ingeniously using his knee to provide necessary stabilization for the gun. Radio operator Forrest Dillman, whose combat duties were typically circumscribed, had seized a spare machine gun and was now actively contributing to the desperate defensive barrage, firing through an open window aperture. Even navigator Ruby Johnston, whenever he momentarily disengaged from the critical task of plotting their perilous escape route, was actively engaged in the fight, tirelessly feeding ammunition belts to the beleaguered gunners and vociferously relaying the positions of the attacking enemy fighters. This widespread, improvised resistance underscored the crew's unwavering resolve. At precisely 9:15 hours, 7 grueling minutes into the relentless aerial engagement, with the critical photographic mission now successfully concluded, Captain Zeamer finally uttered the words that every man aboard was yearning to hear. "Photo's done. We're getting out of here." With a decisive motion, he thrust the control yoke forward, causing old 660 SIX's nose to dip and initiating a rapid acceleration. While the formidable B-17 possessed no inherent capability to outpace the agile Zeros, indeed, virtually no aircraft could, each incremental mile-per-hour gain served to complicate the enemy's precise targeting calculations. Observing their quarry attempting to disengage, the Japanese pilots intensified their assaults with even greater aggression. They were acutely aware of the American crew's injuries, and could plainly observe the extensive damage inflicted upon the bomber, the telltale plume of smoke streaming from the No. 3 engine, and significant sections of aluminum skin ripped away from the fuselage. Yet, Old 666 continued to wage a fierce and unyielding defense with every fiber of its being. The torrent of defensive fire never faltered. Zeamer's foresightful modifications ensured they still possessed ample ammunition, a stark contrast to other bombers that would have long since been rendered defenseless. After 13 minutes of assailing what should have been an easily vanquished target, the Zeros had sustained substantial losses, with at least 5 aircraft confirmed destroyed and several others visibly damaged. The seasoned Japanese pilots, recognizing the disproportionate cost of their continued aggression, were experienced enough to conclude that the strategic gains no longer justified the escalating attrition. The relentless aerial combat had finally ceased. The enemy fighters, having overstepped their operational range, broke off their relentless assault at approximately 9:20, turning their noses back towards their distant havens. A profound, almost suffocating silence descended upon the interior of Old 666, replacing the cacophony of battle. There were no jubilant cries, no expressions of relief. The crew members were too preoccupied with their own grievous injuries. The sudden cessation of gunfire and the settling of the engines back into their customary drone allowed the horrifying truth of their predicament to become piercingly clear. The wind shrieked through the numerous perforations riddling the fuselage, a mournful lament. A disquieting rattle emanated from the No. 3 engine, which, having sustained multiple direct hits, was now a source of more destructive vibration than propulsive power. Amidst the ragged, desperate breaths of the men, the rhythmic drip of hydraulic fluid underscored the severity of their damages, while beneath it all, the hushed, grim sounds of individuals confronting the full extent of their wounds permeated the strained atmosphere. Zeamer, the aircraft commander, attempted a rapid assessment of his damaged bomber, finding little to alleviate his burgeoning concerns. He retained only partial command of the aircraft's control surfaces. The rudder responded with an unnerving sluggishness, while the ailerons, though functional, demanded twice the usual physical exertion to manipulate, their trim tabs having been utterly destroyed. A significant portion of his instrument panel was either completely inoperative or displaying wildly inaccurate readings. The airspeed indicator was completely gone, leaving them blind to their velocity. The altimeter, fractured and suspect, offered potentially deceptive altitude information. The hydraulic pressure gauge registered a chilling 0, a stark indication that the deployment of landing gear and flaps, crucial for any potential landing at Port Moresby, would present an insurmountable challenge. The very prospect of reaching Port Moresby, still an arduous 600 miles distant, hung precariously in the balance, a journey made even more daunting by Zeamer's growing uncertainty regarding their correct homeward vector. He endeavored to ascertain their current geographical location by consulting the navigation charts, but his vision persistently blurred, a consequence of the wound in his leg, which steadfastly refused to clot properly. A creeping sensation of consciousness ebbing away, like water inexorably escaping cupped hands, began to overtake him. In a desperate bid to maintain lucidity, he violently shook his head, then bit down on his tongue with such force that he tasted blood, any raw stimulus to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. It was then that Britton's voice, though strained with pain, cut through the haze with unwavering resolve. "Jay, please, let me take the controls for a moment. You absolutely must address that bleeding." Zeamer, though his instinct was to resist, to cling to command, possessed the pragmatic wisdom to recognize his imminent incapacitation. With a terse nod, he relinquished the controls, entrusting the battered bomber to his co-pilot. John Britton, himself grievously wounded, flew on sheer, unadulterated willpower. His own leg injuries, far more severe than he had let on, sent searing agony through his hips and spine with every minute adjustment to the controls. Yet, Zeamer's immediate medical needs were paramount, and the remaining crew members were in no condition to render effective assistance. Britain maintained the aircraft's precarious stability while Zeamer, with grim efficiency, fashioned a makeshift tourniquet around his own leg using a torn strip of his flight jacket. This crude, battlefield improvisation, though primitive, effectively stemmed the profuse bleeding, buying precious moments. In the cramped confines of the nose compartment, they discovered Joe Sarnoski, slumped inertly over his gun, finally succumbing to the profound effects of blood loss. Navigator Ruby Johnston, his heart heavy with foreboding, crawled forward to examine him, already anticipating the grim reality. Sarnoski's respiration was shallow and erratic, his pulse a faint, thready whisper against the clamor of the damaged aircraft. Johnston, possessing no formal medical training beyond rudimentary first aid, had, through the brutal crucible of combat, witnessed enough casualties to tragically recognize the unmistakable signs of mortal wounds. There was, in that moment, nothing to be done save for making Sarnoski as comfortable as humanly possible, nurturing a desperate hope that he would cling to life long enough to receive proper medical intervention. Johnston meticulously swaddled him in every available jacket and blanket, a futile yet empathetic attempt to stave off the complete onset of shock. The radio, though severely damaged, retained a vestige of functionality. Forrest Dillman, with trembling hands, managed to transmit a concise message to Port Moresby, reporting the successful completion of their mission, their homeward trajectory, the extensive casualties sustained, and the urgent requirement for ambulances upon their arrival. The response, heavily distorted by static interference, seemed to convey an acknowledgment, though the certainty of rescue crews actually awaiting them remained a perilous conjecture. Standard operational protocols for aircraft suffering such catastrophic damage typically dictated an assumption of non-return, with preparations for the direst outcome. Ruby Johnston, his hands visibly shaking, painstakingly worked his navigation tables. He himself had sustained a shoulder wound, a painful secret he had stoically kept from his comrades. Dead reckoning navigation, even under optimal conditions, was an intricate blend of precise mathematics and informed conjecture. With compromised instruments, unpredictable wind patterns, and no reliable means of verifying their true ground speed, Johnston was essentially navigating by a perilous combination of raw instinct and fervent prayer. He imparted a heading of 185 degrees to Britain, instructing him to maintain it for the ensuing hour. If Johnston's calculations held true, this course would guide them southward, towards the relative safety of the Solomon Sea, away from the hostile expanse of Japanese-controlled territory. Should his calculations prove erroneous, however, they risked flying directly over another enemy airfield, inviting further catastrophe. Zeamer slowly regained consciousness approximately 20 minutes later, immediately resuming command of the controls from Britain. The co-pilot offered no resistance, his own strength having dwindled to a precarious flicker. A grim rhythm soon established itself. They would alternate control every 15 or 20 minutes, with the individual marginally less prone to immediate unconsciousness taking the yoke while the other snatched a fleeting moment of respite. This was, unequivocally, not the prescribed method for operating multi-engine bombers according to aviation manuals, but then again, nothing about their current, desperate situation adhered to any established protocol. The No. 3 engine, a source of increasing concern, finally succumbed completely around 10:30 hours, ceasing with a horrifying, grinding shriek that reverberated ominously through the entire airframe. Zeamer, with practiced precision, feathered the propeller and cut off the fuel supply to the knouted engine. Old 666 could, in theory, maintain flight on 3 engines, but barely. Their altitude began an inexorable descent, 25,000 feet, then 20,000, then 15,000. Each 1,000 feet lost amplified the inherent risk of encountering Japanese patrol aircraft, a terrifying prospect. But the unyielding laws of physics were indifferent to their plight. The bomber descended, regardless of their desperate wishes. At approximately 11:30, they crossed what Johnston, through his tenacious calculations, determined to be the precise midpoint of their arduous journey. 300 miles lay behind them. 300 miles still stretched ahead. The crew had exhausted the limited scope of self-administered medical care they could provide, which primarily consisted of hastily applied bandages and tourniquets. The astonishing fact that everyone was still alive seemed nothing short of a minor miracle. However, sustaining life for the next 3 agonizing hours would demand that Old 666 defy all reasonable expectations of structural integrity. The bomber was visibly hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid, leaking precious fuel from ruptured tanks, vibrating violently from damaged control surfaces, and was being held aloft by 3 increasingly questionable engines and an indomitable, collective stubbornness. The crew placed their unwavering trust in Zeamer. Zeamer, in turn, placed his faith in the aircraft he had meticulously rebuilt with his own hands, and somewhere high above the vast, unforgiving Solomon Sea, bleeding and broken, they all pressed onward, flying resolutely toward the elusive promise of home. To truly grasp the profound motivations behind Zeamer and his crew's willingness to embark upon what was universally acknowledged as a suicidal mission, one must fully comprehend the immense strategic significance of those reconnaissance photographs to the broader Pacific campaign. This endeavor transcended mere personal glory or reckless acts of heroism. The images Old 666 had painstakingly captured, now securely stored within the film magazines nestled in the bomber's nose compartment, shielded by the unconscious form of Joe Sarnosky, contained intelligence that would directly preserve countless lives and fundamentally alter the strategic landscape of the Solomon Islands. Operation Cartwheel represented General Douglas MacArthur's ingenious strategic blueprint to neutralize the formidable Japanese stronghold at Rabaul without necessitating a direct, costly assault. The underlying concept was elegantly simple: systematically capture or neutralize the various airfields encircling Rabaul, thereby effectively severing its vital supply lines and crippling its air support until the base was rendered strategically irrelevant. However, the successful execution of such a strategy demanded exceptionally detailed and current knowledge of Japanese dispositions throughout the entire Solomon Islands chain. Precisely where were these critical airfields located? What was their operational capacity in terms of aircraft support? What were the most advantageous approaches for Allied naval bombardment? Where could Allied forces execute safe and effective landings? These pivotal questions could not be answered with mere speculation or outdated intelligence reports. They necessitated current, high-resolution aerial photographs, providing an irrefutable visual record. The specific geographical area Zeamer had been tasked to photograph, encompassing Buka and Bougainville, was of paramount importance because it lay directly athwart the crucial supply route connecting Rabaul with the Japanese positions in the southern Solomons. Intelligence reports had strongly suggested that the Japanese were actively expanding existing airfields at Buka and constructing entirely new facilities at several strategic locations across Bougainville. However, intelligence reports suggested was insufficient for the rigorous demands of operational planning. MacArthur's staff required precise coordinates, exact runway lengths, the exact number and various types of anti-aircraft emplacements, the locations of vital fuel storage facilities, and dozens of other granular details that only comprehensive aerial photography could furnish. Previous attempts to photograph these heavily fortified installations had either failed to achieve the necessary proximity for detailed imagery or had been violently repelled by swarms of Japanese fighters before completing their photographic coverage. Yet, there existed an even more immediate and profoundly human imperative for this perilous mission. A staggering 9 Allied bomber crews, collectively representing nearly 90 brave airmen, were at that very moment either adrift in the vast ocean or desperately concealed on tiny, isolated islands scattered throughout the Bougainville area. They had been shot down during preceding bombing runs over the preceding 3 weeks. Some had managed to reach uninhabited islands, where they now awaited the faint hope of rescue. Others, trapped on Japanese-occupied islands, relied entirely on the clandestine assistance of sympathetic local inhabitants to evade detection by relentless enemy patrols. The United States Navy possessed submarines and PBY Catalina flying boats capable of attempting these dangerous rescue operations, but they critically required precise intelligence, the exact operational patterns of Japanese patrol boats, which islands harbored enemy garrisons, and which approach routes offered a relatively safer passage for extraction. Zeamer's invaluable photographs would provide this life-saving intelligence. The high-altitude images would meticulously reveal Japanese patrol patterns, pinpoint the precise locations of coastal gun emplacements, and delineate which beaches were under constant surveillance versus those sufficiently remote for clandestine pickup operations. Intelligence analysts back at Port Moresby were already meticulously preparing their workstations, poised to develop the photographic film the very instant Old 666 returned. Within mere hours of the film's development, they would possess the critical information necessary to meticulously plan and execute daring rescue operations. And within a matter of days, submarines would be en route to designated pickup locations, areas previously deemed far too perilous to even contemplate approaching. The profound strategic significance of this mission extended far beyond the immediate objective of personnel retrieval. The crucial photographs would meticulously document the Japanese advancement in their infrastructural development on new airfields, providing critical insights to Allied strategists regarding the imperative pace required for their advance within Operation Cartwheel. Should the Japanese forces be nearing the completion of fresh runways, such intelligence would drastically alter the overall schedule and tactical considerations for the entire campaign. Moreover, these invaluable images promise to uncover vital logistical depots, munitions repositories, and command and control centers, all prime objectives for subsequent aerial assaults. Simultaneously, naval intelligence branches would leverage the detailed coastal photographs to refine existing navigational maps and pinpoint suitable maritime havens, thereby facilitating future amphibious landings. Beyond the tangible military gains, there existed an invaluable psychological dimension, though one seldom formally acknowledged within official military communiques. Allied aircrews throughout the Pacific theater were acutely aware of the perilous predicament of the 9 aircrews stranded and awaiting rescue. They understood that the ambiguous designation of "rescue operations pending" was often tantamount to being declared presumed lost, when operational circumstances rendered retrieval too perilous. The act of the military dispatching aerial assets to extricate those individuals, of jeopardizing invaluable assets to bring them home, imparted a profound message to every aviator and flight personnel in the theater, a steadfast commitment to never forsake its personnel. This belief held immense significance in a theater of operations, where aircrews sustained casualty rates ranging from 30 to 40%. The assurance that their service would deploy resources for their recovery, even when deep within hostile domains, made it mentally feasible to persist in undertaking hazardous aerial sorties on a daily basis. The photographic evidence gathered on June 16, 1943, was destined to be meticulously scrutinized and systematically catalogued as Intelligence Report 447B. Portions of this critical data would be disseminated to Naval Command staff orchestrating the amphibious assault on New Georgia in July. Other sections would provide crucial data for the Marine Expeditionary Force's landing at Bougainville itself in November 1943. Air Force targeting specialists would leverage these images to devise bombing campaigns extending deep into the following year, 1944. Remarkably, some of those images retained their classified status until the 1970s, owing to the extensive breadth of information they disclosed about Allied aerial surveillance proficiencies and advanced photographic analysis methodologies. Yet, on that fateful day, gravely wounded and valiantly struggling to maintain the crippled old 666 aloft, Zeamer and his crew were acutely aware that the precious film magazines aboard their aircraft held intelligence of paramount importance, justifying their immense sacrifice. They could not fathom the multitude of future military operations that would ultimately hinge upon their photographs. They did not yet know they would contribute significantly to the successful extraction of 87 out of the 90 imperiled airmen. They simply knew that their comrades in arms were relying upon their perseverance to successfully conclude the perilous mission and secure the vital photographic evidence for transit home. Such a profound sense of duty provided ample motivation. Indeed, it had always been the driving force. Old 666 limped precariously over the landing strip at the Port Moresby Air Base at precisely 14:10 hours, approximately 5 arduous hours subsequent to its departure. Attentive ground personnel observed the inbound bomber and instantly recognized the unmistakable signs of a catastrophic incident. The aircraft was emitting plumes of smoke from numerous damaged sections, maintaining a dangerously low altitude of merely 8,000 feet, significantly below its customary operational ceiling of 15,000 feet. Furthermore, its descent path was alarmingly unstable, a manner of flight that strongly indicated severe flight control malfunctions or a pilot rendered incapable of effective command. The air traffic control tower promptly diverted all other aerial movements and dispatched a full complement of emergency response vehicles to the airstrip. Medical ambulances, fire suppression apparatus, and specialized crash recovery teams strategically arrayed themselves along the asphalt surface, bracing for the gravest possible outcome. Zeamer was compelled to laboriously engage the manual crank mechanism to extend the landing gear, as the aircraft's hydraulic system had suffered total incapacitation. This arduous task required the concerted effort of Zeamer and Britain, working on the hand crank for an agonizing span of almost 10 minutes, each man enduring intense pain, clenching their jaws against their grievous injuries. When the undercarriage ultimately secured into its extended position, they lacked any definitive means to confirm that the complete trio of landing wheels had properly deployed, relying solely on tactile feedback and the fervent hope that the cockpit indicator lamps were functioning accurately. The wing flaps presented an equally daunting challenge, being immobilized in a partially extended configuration, which meant that, consequently, the touchdown velocity would be perilously elevated. Zeamer guided the heavy bomber in at an accelerated pace, making contact with the tarmac at an astonishing 140 miles per hour, a speed significantly exceeding the standard 90 miles per hour. Old 666 rebounded violently, briefly stabilized, then lurched once more before finally settling firmly onto the ground, traversing the entire expanse of the airstrip before Zeamer skillfully managed to bring the battered machine to a complete halt. Medical personnel immediately converged upon the airframe, even as the propellers continued their rotation. They discovered 10 individuals, each bearing injuries. Zeamer and Britton had to be forcibly extricated from their positions within the cockpit. Both had effectively lost consciousness the instant their piloting duties ceased. The personnel manning the waist gun positions struggled to remain upright. The rear gunner displayed severe powder burns marring his countenance, a consequence of the sustained discharge of his weaponry within the confined tail section. And in the forward compartment, the medical teams located the lifeless form of Joe Sarnosky, who had tragically perished sometime over the vast expanse of the Solomon Sea, estimated to be around 1,300 hours, his body still slumped resolutely over his operational gunnery station. He had maintained his combat vigil for an astonishing 3 hours, despite sustaining injuries that would typically have proven fatal within mere minutes. The photographs were processed without delay. Intelligence analysts toiled ceaselessly throughout the night of June 16th and into June 17th, compiling comprehensive analytical reports even as Zeamer and his crew were undergoing critical surgical procedures and medical care. The clarity and detail of the photographic evidence proved to be exceptional. Sharp, unblemished photographic renditions revealed every minute detail deemed essential by Allied strategists. One could discern and enumerate individual aircraft positioned at Kahili Airfield. One could observe the advancements in the construction of novel aircraft revetments and connecting taxiways. Enemy coastal artillery emplacements were distinctly discernible, accompanied by their projected fields of fire. Japanese patrol craft anchorages were explicitly delineated. The resulting intelligence dossiers exceeded 200 pages in length, meticulously cross-referenced and extensively annotated, and were rapidly disseminated across various operational commands. Barely 2 days elapsed before the initial rescue mission was initiated, directly informed by the invaluable photographic intelligence gathered by Old 666. A United States Navy submarine successfully extracted 6 imperiled aviators from an isle that, according to the photographic evidence, was devoid of Japanese military presence. Throughout the subsequent 3-week period, meticulously coordinated operations led to the successful recovery of 87 out of the 90 imperiled individuals. 3 men had unfortunately succumbed to their wounds or had been apprehended by enemy forces prior to the arrival of rescue assets, but a remarkable 87 individuals were safely repatriated. These fortunate men were acutely aware of the precise reason for their deliverance. News of this extraordinary feat rapidly circulated among the Allied aircrews operating in the Pacific, detailing the audacious mission that had meticulously charted enemy dispositions and thereby enabled these critical extractions. Proposals for valorous commendations commenced without delay. Zeamer's commanding officer, who harbored a candid expectation of never witnessing any of the crew again, drafted the preliminary commendations on June 18, even as his aviators were undergoing critical surgical interventions. The recognitions progressed through official channels with unprecedented alacrity. By the advent of July, the judgments regarding these honors had been conclusively rendered. Captain Jay Zeamer Jr. was to be bestowed with the prestigious Medal of Honor for his exemplary display of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, far surpassing the prescribed demands of duty. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky was to be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for exhibiting conspicuous gallantry and unwavering intrepidity, risking his very life beyond the ordinary bounds of duty. It was an exceptionally infrequent occurrence for 2 individuals from a solitary aircrew to be granted the Medal of Honor for their collective participation in a singular engagement. While instances of this nature had occurred previously, they numbered only a mere handful throughout the annals of American military history. The remaining members of the valiant crew, co-pilot John Britton, navigator Ruby Johnston, bombardier George Kendrick, who replaced Sarnosky on later missions, engineer Johnny A.L., radio operator Forrest Dillman, and gunners Herbert Pugh, William Vaughan, and Bud Thursday, were each presented with the Distinguished Service Cross, the second most esteemed military decoration bestowed by the nation. Each and every individual aboard the aircraft was honored with one of the two highest accolades for military valor. Such an unparalleled distinction had never before been recorded within the annals of the Army Air Forces. The entirety of an aircrew, with every single member receiving acknowledgment with either the Medal of Honor or the Distinguished Service Cross for a solitary operational sortie. This remarkable fact testified profoundly to the utterly unprecedented nature of their actions, and the indispensable and pivotal contribution rendered by each crewman. Zeamer endured a 3-month period of recuperation from his grievous injuries. The wounds sustained to his leg and arm necessitated a series of intricate surgical procedures, and medical professionals initially harbored doubts regarding his future capacity for flight. He defied these prognostications, however, resuming restricted flight responsibilities in the latter part of 1943, though he never again engaged in active combat sorties. His physical form had sustained an irreparable degree of trauma. Britain, in contrast, achieved a complete recovery and continued to participate in combat operations until the cessation of hostilities. The gunnery personnel, once their injuries had mended, rejoined their respective squadrons. The majority endured the conflict. Regrettably, others did not. Such was the stark and unforgiving arithmetic inherent to the Pacific Air Campaign. Old 666 also took to the skies once more. Dedicated maintenance. Teams devoted weeks to meticulously mending her extensive battle damage, installing hundreds of feet of new control cabling, reinforcing compromised structural components, and completely substituting the aircraft's entire forward fuselage section. She was subsequently reinstated into active service, continuing its vital reconnaissance duties for an additional year before ultimately being decommissioned and dismantled in late 1944. By then, she had amassed a greater tally of operational combat hours, and withstood a more extensive degree of damage than virtually any other B-17 deployed within the Pacific Theater of Operations. The narrative of Old 666 extended far beyond the bestowal of valorous awards and the confines of hospital recovery wards. The extraordinary achievements of Zeamer and his dedicated crew on June 16, 1943, fundamentally reshaped the Army Air Force's perspectives concerning the execution of reconnaissance sorties, the implementation of aircraft modifications, and the critical interplay between individual ingenuity and overall military efficacy. The profound insights gleaned from that singular, pivotal flight reverberated throughout aerial doctrine for many subsequent years, exerting a discernible impact on every facet, from the conceptualization of bomber aircraft to the rigorous training of aircrews and the meticulous protocols for mission strategizing. First and foremost, there was an instantaneous and profound tactical consequence. Prior to the audacious mission undertaken by Old 666, the prospect of conducting photographic reconnaissance deep within hostile airspace was deemed so inherently perilous that aircrews possessed the prerogative to decline such assignments without incurring any official punitive measures. The prevailing unofficial directive was to solicit volunteers and readily countenance a refusal as compelling personnel to undertake what were universally regarded as suicide missions, irrevocably eroded morale and diminished operational effectiveness. However, Zeamer unequivocally demonstrated that, given appropriate aircraft enhancements, meticulously tailored crew instruction, and a judicious tactical methodology, even objectives situated within formidable defensive perimeters could be successfully documented photographically. Within a span of mere weeks, the command structure of 5th Air Force Headquarters disseminated updated directives concerning reconnaissance aircraft, formally advocating for augmented defensive armament. This move essentially institutionalized the proactive alterations Jay Zeamer had independently implemented. The comprehensive engineering modifications extended far beyond the mere addition of more weaponry. Zeamer's ingenious enhancements, which included reinforced armor plating, a strategically repositioned ammunition storage system for superior weight distribution, and an intricate network of enhanced interlocking fields of fire, were by no means arbitrary adjustments. Instead, they signified a systematic and profound reevaluation of how a bomber should be configured for the specialized demands of reconnaissance operations, as opposed to conventional bombing sorties. Engineers at Boeing were furnished with photographic evidence of old 660 SIX's groundbreaking modifications, and subsequently, discernible elements of Zeamer's innovative design began to manifest in later B-17 variants, and in the significantly improved defensive systems integrated into B-24 Liberators. The fundamental principle that reconnaissance aircraft needed the inherent capability to engage in combat to extricate themselves from perilous situations, rather than merely attempting to evade, became deeply ingrained within Air Force doctrine. Beyond the technical innovations, military analysts meticulously scrutinized the human element of this extraordinary mission. A pivotal question emerged. How did a crew, largely comprising individuals who had been overlooked, underestimated, or relegated to the sidelines, manage to outperform more celebrated units when the stakes were at their absolute highest? The discernible answer appeared to lie in Zeamer's unconventional methodology for assembling his team. He deliberately avoided selecting the most decorated gunners, or the pilots boasting the highest efficiency ratings. Instead, he chose men who, while competent, harbored an ardent desire for validation, who placed unwavering reliance on one another, and who had undergone extensive collective training. Prior to undertaking the perilous Buka mission, they had diligently flown dozens of mapping assignments, thereby cultivating a level of coordination and seamless communication that more prestigious, often rotating, crews sometimes conspicuously lacked. This particular insight reverberated across crew assignment policies throughout the duration of the war. Rather than perpetually rotating personnel to address vacancies or compensate for losses, commanding officers began to prioritize keeping successful crews intact for extended periods, recognizing that unit cohesion represented an invaluable combat multiplier. The men aboard Old 666 possessed an intimate familiarity with each other's voices, could instinctively anticipate one another's actions, and maintained an unshakable confidence that every individual would fulfill their responsibilities even under the most catastrophic circumstances. This profound trust was fostered organically over many months of flying together, and it simply could not be replicated by the administrative act of merely assigning skilled individuals to fill positions on a crew roster. Furthermore, the mission evolved into a paradigmatic example of leadership operating under extreme duress. Zeamer's critical decision-making during the harrowing engagement, his unwavering resolve to complete the photographic run despite being under relentless attack, his tenacious effort to remain conscious through severe wounds to pilot the aircraft home, and his pragmatic decision to relinquish command to Britain when his physical capabilities were failing. These actions became pedagogical illustrations at pilot training schools. They were presented not as fanciful tales of superhuman endurance, but as pragmatic demonstrations of how effective leaders make calculated, albeit excruciating, decisions even when every available option appears dire. Zeamer did not vanquish 17 Japanese fighters through an exhibition of superior individual combat prowess. He overcame them by steadfastly refusing to countenance the mission's failure, and by placing his absolute trust in his crew to expertly manage their individual responsibilities, while he meticulously handled his own. For the families of the 87 rescued airmen, the narrative held a profoundly personal significance. Several of those individuals subsequently completed their tours of duty and returned home to lives that would not have unfolded had it not been for the crucial intelligence gleaned from old 660 SIXS photographs. Children were born who would otherwise never have existed. Businesses were founded that would never have materialized. The expansive ripple effects of preserving 87 lives extended across multiple generations. A number of those rescued airmen maintained enduring bonds with members of Zeamer's crew for the remainder of their lives. Others, in a powerful act of remembrance, even named their sons after Joe Sarnosky. The unquantifiable calculus of sacrifice and salvation does not neatly align on any conventional ledger, yet all individuals involved profoundly understood the immense cost that had been paid and the invaluable lives that had been preserved. Jay Zeamer himself enjoyed a long life, passing away in 2007 at the venerable age of 88. He seldom spoke about the mission publicly, characteristically redirecting accolades and attention to his crew whenever journalists inquired about his Medal of Honor. In his twilight years, he articulated a sentiment that succinctly encapsulated the fundamental ethos behind why ordinary people often achieve extraordinary feats. We just did what needed doing. Other people were depending on those photographs, and we had the aircraft and the crew to get them. It wasn't about being heroes. It was about not letting people down. That profound sentiment, the unwavering commitment to not abandon a mission when others are depending on its successful completion, truly constituted the enduring legacy of Old 666. The bomber itself met a utilitarian fate, being dismantled for scrap metal in 1944 to construct other vital aircraft. Consequently, no tangible remnants of Old 666 survive in museums today. No physical memorial exists to mark the precise spot where Old 666 once sat on the airfield at Port Moresby. However, the original photographs captured on June 16, 1943, persist within the venerable National Archives, meticulously catalogued and preserved in climate-controlled repositories. Any member of the public can request to view them. One can examine the identical images that intelligence analysts scrutinized 8 decades ago, trace the very same coastlines, and count the identical aircraft. They are merely photographs now, historical documents from a global conflict that concluded before the vast majority of living people were born. Yet, once, men bled for those crucial images, men perished defending them, and countless other men live on because someone, against all odds, brought them home.